My name is Sarah Miller. I am standing in the polished marble lobby of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, watching my brother Julian adjust his $2,000 Italian suit in the reflection of a glass pillar. He's laughing. It's that sharp, jagged laugh he uses whenever he wants to feel superior. Right now, he's pointing at my husband's boots, scuffed brown leather boots that have seen better days. Julian doesn't know that in exactly 10 minutes, those very boots will be walking him out of this building for good, and his high-priced career will be nothing but a memory. For 6 years, I watched my family treat Elias like he was invisible, or worse, like he was a stain on their perfect corporate reputation. My parents, my brother, they all saw a broke man with no ambition. They saw a guy who drove an old truck and wore thrift store flannels. They spent every Sunday dinner, every holiday, and every family gathering reminding me that I had settled. They called him a financial burden. They whispered about how I was wasting my life with someone who couldn't even afford a decent watch. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that while they were busy mocking his shoes, Elias was quietly signing the documents to own the ground they stood on. He wasn't just a simple man, he was the silent architect of their downfall, and today, the blueprints are finally being revealed. Welcome back to our channel, where real family stories are shared with honesty, dignity, and the kind of quiet strength that changes everything. If you find value in these stories of justice and truth, please consider subscribing to support us and joining our community of listeners who believe that character matters more than a bank balance. Now, let me tell you how we ended up in that lobby, and how 6 years of silence led to the most satisfying 10 minutes of my life. To understand the weight of the silence I've kept for 6 years, you first have to understand the world I grew up in. In our house, love wasn't something you felt, it was something you calculated. My father, Walter Miller, and my mother, Martha, built their lives on the foundation of the Miller Logistics Group. It wasn't just a business, it was our identity. Every dinner conversation revolved around freight margins, expansion into the Midwest, and, most importantly, the image of the Miller family. Then there was Julian, my older brother, the golden boy. Julian was the crown prince of Miller Logistics. He drove a Porsche that cost more than some people's houses and wore suits that seemed to be surgically attached to his ego. To my parents, Julian was the proof that they had succeeded. He was loud, he was aggressive, and he was the vice president of a firm that was, on the surface, thriving in the heart of Chicago. I was the other child, the quiet paralegal who worked downtown and didn't care for the high society galas my mother lived for. I met Elias Thorne on a rainy Tuesday at a small coffee shop near my office. He wasn't wearing a designer suit. He was wearing a faded navy hoodie and work boots that had seen a few miles. He was reading a book on architectural history, and when he looked up at me, he didn't see a Miller. He saw me. Elias was a structural engineer, or so he told me, working on projects around the city. He lived in a modest apartment, drove a 2012 Ford truck with a dent in the passenger door, and preferred a quiet walk in Millennium Park over a rooftop party in the Gold Coast. When I told my mother I was dating him, she didn't even look up from her iPad. "Is he a partner at the firm?" she asked. When I told her he worked for himself, she finally looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "A handyman, Sarah? Really?" That was the label they gave him before they even met him. To them, if you weren't accumulating titles, you were failing. The first time Elias came to Sunday dinner, the air in my parents' dining room was so thick with judgment you could have cut it with one of my mother's silver steak knives. Julian spent 40 minutes talking about his new investment portfolio, while Elias sat quietly, listening. When Julian finally deigned to speak to Elias, it wasn't a question, it was an interrogation. "So, Elias, Sarah says you're in engineering. Which firm? Or are you just one of those guys who fixes bridges for the city?" Elias just smiled, that calm, steady smile that I had fallen in love with. "I handle private structural investments and design," he said simply. Julian laughed, a sharp, condescending sound. "Right. Well, I hope that pays enough for a new truck. That thing in the driveway is an eyesore for the neighborhood." My father didn't defend him. He just looked at his watch and asked if we were ready for dessert. The marriage happened a year later. I wanted a small courthouse ceremony, followed by a dinner with friends. My mother, of course, wanted a spectacle. When I insisted on my way, she leaned across the kitchen table and said the words that would define our relationship for the next 5 years. "You are settling, Sarah. You are choosing a life of mediocrity, and you are embarrassing this family by tying yourself to a man who can't even provide you with a decent zip code." They didn't pay for the wedding. They didn't even offer. They showed up late, sat in the back, and spent the reception whispered commenting on the modest catering. But Elias didn't care. He held my hand, looked me in the eyes, and told me that as long as we were together, we were the wealthiest people in the room. I believed him. But I didn't know the extent of the sacrifice he was making to keep his world a secret, just to see if my family could ever love a person for who they were, rather than what they owned. For the next 5 years, the pattern continued. Thanksgiving was a marathon of accidental insults. My mother would buy me expensive jewelry and say, "I know Elias can't afford things like this, so consider it a gift from the family who actually cares about your status." Julian would forget to invite Elias to corporate mixers, claiming it was for industry professionals only. They treated my husband like a charity case I had brought home from the street, never realizing that every time they mocked his broke status, they were insulting the very man who was quietly watching their company's stock reports with more power than all of them combined. They called us the sensitive ones. They told us we were lucky they still included us in the family business. But as Julian's mismanagement began to leak into the company's foundations, the mockery turned into desperation. They just didn't know that the broke man they laughed at was the only one standing between them and the ruin they so richly deserved. The cracks in the Miller family's polished veneer didn't start with a loud bang. They started with the frantic, sweaty desperation of my brother Julian. It was early November in Chicago, the kind of day where the wind off the lake cuts through you like a serrated blade. I had stopped by the Miller logistics office to drop off some paperwork for my father, and the atmosphere was different. Usually, the lobby buzzed with the arrogance of people who thought they were untouchable. That day, it felt like a funeral home. Julian was in his glass-walled office, pacing. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and his shirt was stained with sweat. For the first time in my life, I saw him without his smirk. He was shouting into his phone about credit lines and late shipments. When he saw me, he didn't even offer a greeting. He just snapped his fingers and pointed toward the door. "Not now, Sarah. We're in the middle of a corporate transition. Go back to your little apartment and your little life." What he didn't know was that I had already seen the ledger sitting on his assistant's desk. Miller Logistics wasn't just struggling, it was hemorrhaging money. Julian's high-risk investments and his executive lifestyle had drained the company's reserves. They were months away from total collapse. That evening, I went home and found Elias in our small home office. He was sitting in his worn leather chair, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in his glasses. To anyone else, he looked like a man playing a complex strategy game, or perhaps doing some freelance coding. I sat on the edge of his desk, watching him. "Elias," I whispered, "the firm is going under. Julian is losing everything." Elias didn't look away from the screen. He just reached out, took my hand, and squeezed it. "I know, Sarah. I've been watching the numbers for months. In fact, I've been waiting for this moment." He rotated the screen toward me. It wasn't a game. It was a portfolio for a firm called Thorn Capital. I recognized the name. It was the mysterious investment group that had been quietly buying up logistics shares across the Midwest. Elias wasn't a struggling engineer. He was the founder and sole owner of Thorn Capital. He had built it from a single laptop, while my family was busy making fun of his truck. He hadn't just saved his money, he had weaponized it. "Why didn't you tell them?" I asked, my voice trembling with the realization of the scale of his power. "Because," Elias said, his voice as calm as a deep well, "I wanted to see if they would ever value a person without a price tag. And because I needed to make sure that when I stepped in, I owned every single brick of that building, including Julian's office." The next few weeks were a masterclass in irony. My parents invited us to dinner, but for the first time, they weren't mocking Elias. They were ignoring him entirely because they were obsessed with their savior. My father, Walter, spent the entire meal talking about a man he had never met, the CEO of Thorn Capital. "He's a ghost," my father said, his voice full of uncharacteristic awe. "No one knows what he looks like, but he has the capital to clear our debt in 24 hours. If he signs the buyout, the Miller legacy is safe. And if he doesn't?" I asked, looking at my mother. "Then we're ruined," Martha said, her voice sharp. "Which is why you need to make sure Elias stays out of the way when the board meeting happens. We can't have a person of his standing lurking around when a billionaire walks into the room." That was the moment I started my own work. While they were busy preparing a red carpet for a mysterious billionaire, I began gathering the discovery for my own case. I am a paralegal, after all. I know how to find what people try to hide. I started with the family's internal email server, Since I still handled some of the legal filings, I had a backup password Julian had forgotten to revoke. What I found made my blood run cold. There was an email thread between Julian, my father, and my mother. The subject line was post-acquisition cleaning. I read the words through tears of pure, cold anger. Julian had written, "Once the Thorn Capital deal is finalized and the funds are moved, we need to cut the dead weight. That means Sarah. She's too close to the books, and that husband of hers is an embarrassment to the company image. We'll offer her a small severance on the condition that she moves out of the state. We can't have the CEO of Thorn seeing our broke son-in-law in the lobby." My father had replied with one word: agreed. I didn't cry for long. Instead, I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it The Miller Ledger. I spent the next 3 nights printing every email, every fraudulent expense report Julian had filed to cover his gambling debts, and every bank statement that showed how they were planning to dump me as soon as they had their money. I organized them into a thick black binder, the binder of truth. I watched Elias as he prepared for the final board meeting. He didn't buy a new suit. He didn't change his truck. He just kept working quietly, his calm demeanor hiding the storm that was about to hit the Miller family. The moral irony was staggering. My parents were literally praying for a miracle from the very man they had refused to let sit at the head of their table. They were begging for salvation from the broke man they had tried to push out of my life. On the night before the boardroom confrontation, I stood in our kitchen and looked at Elias. "Are you ready?" I asked. He picked up his old Ford keys and smiled. "Sarah, I've been ready for 6 years. It's time the Miller family learned that you don't judge a book by its cover, especially when that book owns the library." The morning of the acquisition meeting, Chicago was draped in a thick gray fog that seemed to swallow the tops of the skyscrapers. We arrived at the Thorn Capitol building at 9:45 a.m. It was a monolith of glass and steel, the kind of place that made you feel small just by standing in its shadow. Julian was already there, pacing the lobby in a suit that probably cost more than our first 3 years of rent. My parents stood beside him, looking like they were preparing for a royal coronation rather than a bankruptcy hearing. When Julian saw us, or rather, when he saw Elias, his face twisted into that familiar expression of disgusted pity. "Sarah, why did you bring him?" he hissed, not even bothering to lower his voice as high-powered executives hurried past us. "This is a high-level corporate negotiation, not a family picnic. Elias, do us all a favor and wait in the truck. You're going to embarrass us in front of people who actually matter." My father, Walter, checked his gold watch and sighed. "He's right, Sarah. The chairman of Thorn Capital is a man of immense stature. Having someone of Elias's standing in the room sends the wrong message. It says we aren't serious." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just adjusted the cuff of his simple off-brand jacket and looked Julian straight in the eye. "I think it's important I'm there," Elias said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "After all, this meeting is going to change the Miller family forever. I wouldn't want to miss the look on your face." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "The only thing changing is that we're getting a lifeline from a billionaire, and you're going back to your grease-stained garage." "Fine. Come in, sit in the corner and keep your mouth shut. Maybe you'll learn what a real office looks like." We took the elevator to the 52nd floor in total silence. The doors opened to a boardroom that felt like a cathedral of capitalism. A long, mahogany table sat in the center, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My parents sat on one side, Julian in the middle, preening like a peacock. Elias and I sat at the far end, ignored, like ghosts at a feast. "Where is he?" my mother whispered, clutching her designer purse. "The secretary said the chairman would be here at 10 sharp, probably finishing a multi-billion-dollar deal," Julian said, checking his reflection in the polished wood of the table. "Men like that don't wait for people like us. We wait for them." At exactly 10 a.m., a side door opened. A young man in a sharp suit walked in, carrying a tablet. "The chairman is ready to proceed," he announced. "But before he joins us, he has requested that we review the final internal audit of Miller Logistics." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "An audit? We already submitted our books. The chairman prefers to do his own discovery," the assistant replied. He turned to me. "Mrs. Thorne, do you have the documents?" The room went ice cold. My mother's head snapped toward me. "Mrs. Thorne? Why did he call you that?" I didn't answer her. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick black binder I had spent a week preparing, the binder of truth. I walked to the head of the table and set it down with a heavy thud that echoed through the room. "What is this, Sarah?" my father asked, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" "I'm doing what Julian never had the integrity to do," I said, opening the first tab. "I'm showing the board exactly why Miller Logistics is failing." Tab 1. $3 million in executive expenses filed by Julian Miller over the last 18 months. Most of it spent at high-stakes casinos in Vegas and Atlantic City. Tab 2. A secret email chain between the three of you, discussing how to fire me and exile Elias the moment this buyout was signed. Julian stood up, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "This is a joke! You're sabotaging the family legacy! Security! Get her out of here!" "Sit down, Julian," a voice said. The voice didn't come from me. It came from the side door. Elias had stood up from his corner and was walking toward the head of the table. He didn't look like the broke man they had mocked for years. He looked like the man who owned the sky. The assistant stepped aside. Elias didn't sit in the corner. He sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, the chairman's chair. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that fills a room like water, drowning the breath out of everyone in it. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. He remained half-standing, frozen in a posture of failed aggression. "You," Julian finally managed to choke out. "You're the investor?" Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. "I'm not just the investor, Julian. I'm the owner. I've been buying your debt for 3 years. Every time you lost $1 million at a craps table, I was the one who bought the note. Every time you lied to our parents about market fluctuations to cover your embezzlement, I was the one who recorded the truth." "Elias, honey," my mother said, her voice suddenly sweet, dripping with a desperate, terrifying, forced kindness. "We didn't know. If we had known you were of this stature, we would have treated you differently." Elias looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the pain he had been hiding behind his silence. "That's the point, Martha. You only treat people with dignity when you think they have a high net worth. You spent 6 years mocking my boots, my truck, and my ambition, while I was quietly keeping the roof over your head. You were ready to throw Sarah into the street the moment you thought you didn't need her anymore. I read the emails. I saw the post-acquisition cleaning plan." He turned to the binder I had prepared. "Sarah is a brilliant paralegal. She knows how to find what people try to hide. And what she found is enough to send you to prison, Julian." Julian sank back into his chair. The Porsche, the Italian suits, the arrogance, it all evaporated in an instant. He looked small, pathetic. "I didn't forget the things you said," Elias continued, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't forget you telling Sarah she was settling. I didn't forget you making her sit at the back of our own wedding because our modest life was an embarrassment. Well, Julian, looking at these fraud reports, I'd say you're the only embarrassment in this room." Elias closed the binder and looked at my father. "Walter, you signed the affidavit claiming the company was solvent when you knew it wasn't. You prioritized your golden boy over your own daughter's future. We were protecting the legacy," my father whispered. "No," Elias said, standing up. "You were protecting a lie, and the lie ends today. As the sole owner of Thorn Capital, and now 100% owner of Miller Logistics, I am terminating your employment, Julian. Effective immediately. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. Security will escort you to the curb. And since your company car is technically property of Thorn Capital now, I suggest you call an Uber. Or better yet, maybe you can find a broke man with an old truck to give you a ride." The confrontation wasn't loud. There was no screaming, no throwing of chairs. It was the surgical, quiet precision of the truth finally catching up to 6 years of lies. I stood beside my husband, the man they thought was nothing, and watched as their world of glass and mirrors shattered into 1,000 pieces. The boardroom at Thorn Capital remained frozen for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled sirens of the Chicago streets 52 floors below. Julian was still slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the Thorn Capital logo etched into the glass wall. He looked like a man who had been told the air he was breathing no longer belonged to him. Elias didn't wait for him to recover. He pressed a button on the intercom. 2 security guards, tall and expressionless in dark suits, entered the room. They didn't need instructions. They stood behind Julian's chair, their presence a silent command. Julian, Elias said, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with finality. Your things from the Miller Logistics office have already been boxed. You'll find them with the concierge downstairs. You are no longer authorized to enter that building, or this one. Your company credit cards were deactivated 5 minutes ago. I suggest you find a way home that doesn't involve a car with a company lease. Julian stood up, his movements stiff and jerky. He looked at our father, Walter, as if waiting for a miracle. But my father couldn't even meet his eye. My father was staring at the binder of evidence, finally seeing the wreckage of the lie he had helped build. Without a word, Julian walked out. The sound of his designer loafers clicking against the marble floor was the last thing we heard before the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him. That was when the performance shifted. My mother, Martha, who had been silent in her shock, suddenly found her voice. It wasn't the voice of a mother. It was the voice of a negotiator. She leaned across the table, her face softening into a mask of maternal warmth that I had seen her use 1,000 times at church functions. "Sarah, darling," she began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are so proud of you, and Elias, we always knew there was something special about you. This was all just a misunderstanding, a test, really. We wanted to see if you two were strong enough to handle the pressures of this family. And you passed. Now, let's talk about how we can merge our interests. We can be the most powerful family in the city." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel the need to apologize for existing. I didn't feel the weight of her disappointment. I felt nothing but a clean, cold clarity. "It wasn't a test, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "It was a betrayal. You were willing to fire me and exile the man I love for a check from a stranger. You didn't care about my happiness. You cared about your margins. Well, the margins have shifted. Elias doesn't need your power, and I don't need your approval." My father finally looked up. "Sarah, we're your parents. You can't just cut us out of the business we built." "You didn't build it, Dad," I replied. "You let Julian destroy it while you looked away. Elias bought the company to save the employees, not your lifestyle. You'll still have enough to keep your house, but the luxury perks and executive privileges are over. You wanted a professional transition. This is it." 10 minutes later, they left the boardroom with the defeated posture of people realizing their influence no longer mattered. 6 months later, Miller Logistics became Thorne Miller Logistics. Elias kept the hard-working employees who had been ignored for years and promoted them. He now leads the company with the same quiet integrity that built his own success. Julian moved into a small suburban apartment and works as a mid-level manager for a company unaware of his past. The Porsche is gone. Now he drives a used sedan bought with what remained of his savings. He hasn't called me once. My parents still live in their house, but their once powerful social circle has faded. In Chicago, reputations travel fast. The same people who once fought for invitations to their gala dinners now ignore their calls. Even their lake house has begun to lose its shine without the company-paid staff maintaining it. As for Elias and me, we still live in our home. Every Saturday, he still drives his old Ford truck because it reminds him of the man he was when we first met. A man valued for his heart, not his wealth. Over these 6 years, I learned that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the sound of a foundation being built. I learned that people obsessed with status often have the least to offer. But most importantly, I learned that true wealth isn't money or titles. It's integrity, loyalty, and the courage to stand beside someone when the world tells you to walk away. Elias was never a broke husband. He was a man of immeasurable worth, and my family was too blinded by ego to see it.